Hi, good evening. Welcome to the third of my short lectures on the history of the Italian civilization and literature that I've prepared for the ancient history and the ancient languages groups. We have seen how, with the end of the Western Roman Empire, the decay of the Roman roads, the collapse of the rule of law in Italy, and the threat posed by the incursions of raiders and hostile peoples had pushed many to gather within or close to fortified places. The last descendants of the Roman aristocracy didn't object if humble cottages clumped around the once luxurious villas where the Roman senators had retreated after losing political influence in Rome. The gathering of a community offered a minimum of security in those isolated estates surrounded by advancing forests and abandoned fields. Also, the countless forts inlaid in castra of the many armies that had chased each other for centuries along the Italian peninsula offered some protection from the common nightmare of plunder, slavery, and murder. We have already seen the formation of one of the typical social structures of the Dark Ages, the curtis in the castle, but the castle was not the only community that could offer some protection. We dedicate this third short lecture to another very important community, the monastery, and to its crucial function for the preservation of the heritage of the ancient world. The word monastery and the word monk comes from the Greek word monachos, which means loner, and was used to indicate those who, during the late antiquity, chose to retreat from the world and live a life in close contact with God. They intentionally chose remote locations, and with the time, a few charismatic figures with a reputation of sanctity started to attract disciples who hoped in their protection in this life and in the next. The Church learned to manage intelligently this vast movement, while the foundation of a monastery had to be authorized at least by a bishop as official representative of the ecclesiastical hierarchy. The abbot enjoyed thereafter great autonomy, and the monastery could develop freely while the bishop took care of the city. The concept behind the monastery was, of course, a creation of a self-sufficient community whose needs could be satisfied by local farming and handicraft. In the Italy of the Dark Ages, where people used to be oppressed by arbitrary tributes imposed by barbaric warlords and rapacious Byzantine officials, and by the constant threats of war and banditism, those orderly communities attracted both novices and farmers who settled in their surroundings. With the time, some monasteries attained colossal proportions, with several thousands of monks and large rural communities around them, including poor laborers and refugees from wars and famines. All those people could also find the first form of social assistance there: religious education, hospitals, old age assistance, and eventually even assistance to orphans. Some monasteries engage in production activities, and some of them even maintain private armies that could defend their territories. But the reason why we dedicate a full short lectures to the monasteries, which flourished before the Italian and other European literature started, is that inside those monasteries a phenomenon of capital importance occurred: the codification, which allowed the transmission of the cultural heritage of the Latin world to modern Europe. We also owe to the codification process an enhancement of the cognitive potential of our species, the creation of the book as we know it, at least before its electronic form. I will need to be a little bit technical for the next 5 minutes, and I ask for your understanding. As you know, in classical antiquity, books were completely different objects from the ones we know. The ancient book was a scroll of papyrus, a volumen, from the Latin verb volva, to roll, and in order to create such a scroll, you needed to glue together several sheets of papyrus. Each single sheet had been obtained in the following way. After removing the outer ring from the stem of the papyrus plant, once common on the Nile Delta and in the wetlands of South Sudan, the long strips of the sticky fibrous pith could be detached and placed side by side on a hard surface. Another layer of those strips was posed on the first one with perpendicular orientation. If the first one had been placed vertically, the second ones were placed horizontally. Then the two layers were moistened and pressed together as to form a single sheet with the fibers disposed horizontally on one side and vertically on the other. Usually about 20 sheets were glued together side by side in a single scroll, where the face on which the text was written was left inside, only inside. The act of reading a scroll of papyrus implied therefore the use of two hands, one of them unrolling the scroll and the other rolling it up, like you see me doing right now in this video. This was a typical book of the classical antiquity. However, we also know from the evidence provided by Latin authors like the poet Martial, by Cicero, by others, that the students of ancient Rome who needed to take notes, to learn to do sums, and also people who needed to note down things for professional reasons, used to this purpose a small wooden board, Latin caudex, coated with wax on which they etched with a style their notes. When the notes were no longer needed, the wax was re-smoothed so that it could be reused. It was also possible to use several of those wooden boards, one on top of the other, and tie them together with strips of leather or strings, like the pages of a modern spiral-bound exercise book. And it was also possible to replace those wooden boards with sheets of parchment. And it was in fact the use of parchment as a writing support that triggered a far-ranging revolution in reading and writing. What is parchment? Well, parchment, as everybody knows, is skin of sheep, goats, calves, or other animals, treated in a way that it can be used for writing on it. Parchment is a Middle English word derived from the French parchemin, which in turn derives from the Latin word pergamina, which means material from Pergamon. And this because the use of parchment started to become important in the city of Pergamon, on the Aegean coast of Asia Minor, now Turkey. Why that? In the 2nd century BC, before Christ, King Eumenes of the Attalid dynasty decided to found in Pergamon a library which would rival that of Alexandria in Egypt, glory of the Ptolemaic dynasty. At that point, the Ptolemaic kings, in order to thwart this project, forbid the export of papyrus from Egypt. since papyrus couldn't possibly grow in the dry climate of Anatolia, it became necessary to look for a different writing material, even if this was a more expensive one. And this was how the use of parchment began. This new material had characteristics that would eventually change the way of recording information and the act of reading. If you now have the patience to look about what I'm doing, I will try to give a visual idea of the significance of this technological change. Contrary to the more fragile papyrus made of fibers mashed together, a sheet of parchment can be folded many times easily. If you take a sheet of parchment, typically a bit larger than this sheet I have right now, and fold it one time, you obtain 2 leaves. And since you can write on both sides of each leaf, you have 4 pages, and this format is called folio. If you fold the same 4 times, you make 4 leaves and 8 pages, and the second format is called in quarto. If you fold it 8 times, you obtain 16 pages. This format is called in octavo, which is the most common format of modern books, then sextodecimo, and so on. By sewing together various folded sheets, you obtain a codex. A completely different form of reading support with respect to the scroll of papyrus. The codex could contain an enormous number of pages. They were bound together and placed between 2 plates aimed at protecting the content. Those plates were initially made of wood, of leather. In modern time, lighter material were employed. On the spine of the book, the name of the author could be written, and the name of the work, as to allow the immediate identification of the codex, even when it was placed vertically between others. In summary, the codex had 4 major advantages with respect to the volume. Firstly, it didn't require the 2 hands of the reader to be read. It was also possible to compare different texts by opening several codices on a table at the same time. Secondly, it was possible to write on both sides of a leaf. There was no difference in quality between the recto, that's how the page on the right is called, and the verso, the page on the left. This was a very important advantage in a time in which writing material was extremely scarce. The third advantage was that the codices, as we've seen, were easier to store and to identify with respect to the ancient scrolls of papyrus. The fourth advantage was that the codex made very easy to resume the reading from one point where it had stopped by simply marking the page with a bookmark instead of unrolling a volume and looking among the columns of the text in the inner side of the scroll. We all knew from recent experience that the possibility to resume the vision from the exact point where it has been interrupted has been a decisive competitive advantage for other technologies. For instance, it has provoked the abandonment of magnetic tapes in computers and the replacement of the VHS technology with DVDs. As said, the Codex was a very far-reaching innovation, but also an innovation that took centuries to assert itself. Initially, the spreading of the Codex was limited by the exorbitant cost of the product, which required sometimes dozens of sheep or goats, apart from the time needed to reproduce manually the text. Later on, as the codices started to appear in Italy, their appearance coincided with the decadence of the Western Roman Empire, a long age of decline for the education system and the intellectual elites. Nevertheless, this innovation eventually continued to spread, and in fact, the culture of Christianism will be closely connected to the codices. Whilst the classical world, the culture of paganism, will remain inextricably attached to the volumina, the ancient scrolls. The change of the support on which human knowledge was recorded created the need to transfer the content of the volumina to the codices, and which organization could undertake this gigantic task in times when so many social structures were crumbling? In the Dark Ages, there was only one organization which could do that, the Church. It was the Church that executed this transfer, and this transfer is the codification process, the second subject of this short lecture. In the Greek monasteries that were founded in the Dark Ages, the Church started to create a few libraries that were not the immense one of the ancient world, but in which anyway something was preserved. We can't avoid to mention the figure of Saint Benedict of Nursia, Norcia now in Italy, who lived from 480 to 457 during the Gothic domain in Italy and the terrible Gothic Byzantine world. Not only he founded a dozen of monastic communities, but he established his famous rule on which the life of hundreds of monasteries will be based during the Middle Age. Thanks to St. Benedict's rules, reading and copying ancient manuscript was done in dedicated hours. So gradually it spread. The monastery organized their own scriptoria, workshops, where manuscripts were copied, and those scriptories were supported by other workshops on a long value chain of the production of those codices. There were several things to be done. A parchment had to be produced, had to be scraped, cut in order to obtain sheets of the same dimension, then folded and bound, and then you needed workers who marked the page with thin horizontal lines on which the copyist will eventually write. Then you needed also to rubricate the text, i.e. to divide it into chapters which used to be indicated in red ink, thereby the Latin verb rubricare. Due to the scarcity of writing material, there was also a technique for deleting the text of ancient manuscripts by scraping or washing them and rewrite on their pages, producing a so-called palimpsest, and so on. The monasteries had the workforce needed to perform all these tasks. There were sometimes very large communities with sometimes thousands of people. In the south of Italy, for instance, Monte Cassino and Vivarium. In central Italy, the Abbey of Farfa. In the north of Italy, Bobbio and Novalesa. The abbots were powerful figures, not less than feudatories, and in fact, they were frequently Franks to reflect the new political power in Europe. They ruled over immense territories and gathered large riches by various means. And of course, very important monasteries were also founded in France, in Germany, in Britain. A very important role played the Carolingian Renaissance, with the so-called Renovatio Imperii, which restored the importance of writing in a world that had become confined to verbal communication. The Carolingian Renaissance rediscovered the value of correct Latin syntaxes and introduced other important innovations like the Carolingian minuscule, that with its small pipes below and above the line of the text makes the specific silhouette of each word immediately recognizable to the reader and increases thereby the reading speed. Then the spaces between the single words were introduced. The words had not been spaced in ancient text, and this had forced people to read aloud in order to understand what they were reading. Furthermore, the punctuation was introduced, and the many abbreviation of the Latin script, which had been natural in the past for a script used frequently for carving in stones, these abbreviations were simplified and reduced, and this also increased the ability to read. In summary, reading and writing was made much easier because of the codification and because of the Carolingian Renaissance. And this opened the door to our modern world. In the next, by this short lectures, we have concluded a cycle of 3 that explain the environment of ancient Italy before the Italian literature was born. With the next lecture, we will have a look at the literary production during the Dark Ages, which is still a literature in Latin. Thank you for your attention, and see you soon. Bye.